Good afternoon, everyone. I can see people are starting to arrive, so that's good. I've got a few kind of housekeeping bits that I'll start with just to kick us off. We've got about an hour assigned for today, so I've got about 45 minutes of stuff to talk about. The topic we're covering today is on the slide, so if that's not what you're expecting to see, I shan't be offended if you decide to drop out at this point. We've allowed about 15 minutes for questions at the end, so there is a chat box you can use. So if you've got a particular question, then feel free to use that. And if we run out of time at the end, then what we'll do is we'll collate any questions, we'll answer those, and we'll share those post webinar today. I'm also going to provide a full copy of the slide deck, so if that's useful for you rather than you sitting there trying to scribble notes, then and I'll try and include as many of my notes in there as possible just to help you. This is not a session where I'm going to talk about any particular product in relation to AI. The focus today is solely on thinking through from a compliance point of view the implications in relation to AI. And you may have come here today with very mixed opinions about AI, and I suspect you're here with very mixed experiences. And I'll try and keep as much of the terminology as I can as layman as possible. But unfortunately, just because of the nature of what we're discussing, it's quite difficult to do that in a full capacity. There is an assumption. I've made an assumption. I know it's always dangerous to assume anything, but I've made an assumption that some of you or most of you will know something about GDPR. So that's my first assumption I've made. And this is the first kind of seminar we've run or webinar we've run like this. So any feedback you have at the end for us would be very helpful. In terms of introductions, so just a bit of a welcome really from my perspective. Slide decks. There we go. A bit of a welcome. So a couple of minutes really just to do a bit of an introduction, and then I'll get into the meat of it. So why are we looking to put this webinar on? Well, what we're noticing very firmly from talking to our clients and work with our clients is just the exponential growth of conversation around AI, and there are challenges for many around how they navigate the complexity of AI in the context of data protection. So that's really the main focus for today in terms of what we want to get across really. But it's also about how you can leverage AI tools, but do it in a way that's compliant. So some of the stepping stones around that. So I want to try and equip you with some of the tools and strategies that might help you. What I'm going to cover, I've got a bit of an agenda, but just as a very high level, I'm going to cover some of the background of AI, but again, very high level, just a couple of minutes around that. An overview of data protection law. I'm not going to bore you with that, but it'd be good just to kind of put us on a level playing field for today. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the processes that we would go through to help you understand it. I'm going to offer you some practical methodologies and strategies for risk assessing and mitigation. And in terms of the kind of person that should attend this, I'd suggest it's someone that may be involved in doing GDPR within the business, someone obviously involved in AI products. It could be IT professionals, or it could be a member of a governance team. And in a minute, we're going to have a bit of a poll just to gauge in the room, just kind of the level of experiences we've got and kind of where you're at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are just quickly, so some introductions around that. So this photograph, I should have changed this photo. This photograph was taken about a month before lockdown. And when I thought about this last night, I think this was the last time that I actually wore a suit. So some time ago now, and all the work I do now is from home, work with clients like you. In the years prior to COVID, I was doing about 50,000 miles a year, and I don't think I've done 2,000 miles in the last 5 years. So we're in a very different space now. My background is in charities, technology businesses. I've done lots of work with companies that are looking to exit, look at acquisition-based projects. Most of the work I do with DQM is around things like gap analysis, documentation, and all those good things, but very much in the GDPR space, and AI is something I've focused on since the beginning of the year. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. And then we have DQM. So I'll talk a little bit about DQM for a minute. This is the organisation that's behind this webinar today. That's who I'm employed by and who I work with. We specialise in data protection and privacy, where we offer a range of services. This is not a sales pitch. It's just to kind of give you a little bit of a background, some context and landscape to what we're talking about today. Our focus is very much around GDPR and PECA, which might be one you're not overly familiar with, but they're certainly the two I work with in the main. We're qualified consultants. We come with a whole wide range of expertise, and I'm going to touch on some of those skill sets today because it's very difficult not to present this kind of topic without talking about some of our methodologies around how we do it. And I can't really talk about today without touching on things like cookies and those kinds of things where PECA comes into play, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. And we aim to work with clients who maybe have very specific goals around compliance. Maybe they've not done very much at all. Maybe they've done lots of stuff but just need some sanity checking, or they want someone to look after it in its entirety, really. What sets us apart, in my opinion, is we are very much bespoke, so we try and work with each client and their specific needs. We've got an award-winning set of product, which for me makes my life much more easy when I'm talking to clients around this stuff. And I guess finally to say, I'm not saying any of this to impress you, but just impress upon you that you're in the right place, and we can certainly talk to you about some of the things that we've been doing, particularly in this AI space. Let me just, there we go. So this is not an agenda as such. This is a kind of a summary of what we're going to try and cover. I've tried to create a slide deck that's useful for you with some practical things within it. But it's quite difficult to cover such a broad topic in 45 minutes, and you can probably appreciate that. So we're going to look at things like an introduction to AI and data protection. It is very high level, and we're discussing it because we'll look at GDPR, we'll look at the interplay between GDPR and AI. So how do these regulations impact technologies, and what should you be thinking about? What are some of the key considerations? I'm going to talk about things like gap analysis. We're going to talk a little bit about DPIAs. So if these terms don't mean anything to you right now, don't worry. I'm going to talk about some of those things as part of discussion around methodology. I'm going to give you a bit of a step-by-step guide on how you might go about conducting a DPIA. So if you're not familiar, that will certainly help you for those that are on the call. I'll unpack that a little bit, and we'll also discuss various mitigation strategies, things you can do to help mitigate. We'll look at some of the pitfalls. So what are some of gotchas, if you're old enough to remember gotchas, and the importance of embracing things like privacy by design, another term that you may be unfamiliar with. And then we'll look finally with some kind of key recommendations for success from our experience. And just to reiterate, it's quite a lot of content in these slides. I'm trying to get it into 45 minutes, but like I say, I'm happy to give you a full copy of my notes. So I'm looking at my notes as we speak, although they're brief, they'll mean something to you. So hopefully as a follow-up, that'll be helpful. We've got a poll. So there are 3 questions that you're being asked now. And the first one is your organisation currently using AI apps in its day-to-day business? Feel free to participate or not. It's entirely up to you. And you can see the options on the screen. and someone will, because I'll give you a minute just to see that. So if you can you say if you can see the poll? Is that coming up all right? I'll assume it is. So I'll give you yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, cheers. All good. Thumbs up. Thank you for those. That's good. Yeah. So just give you I didn't give it very long because it's a fairly straightforward question to answer. The second one. Oops. As a data protection lead, so I'll make an assumption here that's your role. Are you being involved in the implementation of AI? So again, yes or no. You may not be a data protection lead, but maybe widen that question to whether that's something you're involved in from a business point of view. And the third point is how do you feel AI integration will affect your data protection compliance, whether it be negatively. You can see those options. Oops, on the screen. Got on the screen. Give me a second. Yeah, that's the third question. It's just how you feel that's going to affect you. Give you a second to look at that. So that's the only poll we're running today. So don't be the rest of the stuff. You can just sit back and listen. But those three questions just useful for us to gauge a little bit about what's going on out there, really. So the rise of AI business, it's not surprising that this webinar is running. I think what was interesting for me is just the number of people that have expressed interest. And talking to clients, we've seen a kind of massive amount of interest and traction around this stuff. What we know for certain is what AI is doing from a positive perspective in the industry. So, for example, in healthcare, we know that AI is revolutionising the diagnostics and patient care by predicting things like disease outbreak, also things like personalising treatment plans, patient outcomes. So there's loads of good stuff going on in that particular space. In the finance sector, we know, for example, there's a lot more that's being done around fraud detection, around risk management, algorithmic trading, so which provide far more accurate results than traditional methods. Retailers are using it for things like personalizing shopping experiences, they'll optimize inventory management, they'll predict consumer trends, and all of those have net benefits for both the consumer and for the retail business. In the manufacturing sector, we're seeing things like it driving the development of smart factories. So we can see a lot more work being done around predictive maintenance, quality control, supply chain optimization, those kinds of things. Transportation, we can see things like autonomous vehicles. There's been lots of talk about that in the press. Traffic management systems, logistics, and there's some examples there of where AI is proving to be useful. So another sector which is completely off track in one sense. I did a recent workshop for a Church of England diocese, and we explored the role of AI ministry. So a very completely different field, but what we identified were 9 specific key areas which would yield tangible results. And my recommendation would be, if you've not done any kind of workshop in your organisation to really think through some of the benefits, then it's definitely worth doing. It's also fair to say that AI isn't going away. I mean, this is here to stay. It's not new. We're going to touch on that. It's been around since the mid-20th century. And what we've seen latterly is just this clear, what seems like an exponential growth in AI. But actually, those advancements have been there for some time, but just maybe not in the mainstream way that we're seeing it today. But the challenge for most people is well, okay, this is all great, but what are the challenges for us as a business? What are the things we should think through? And that's kind of some of the stuff I want to talk through today. I just want to change. I just realised my questions screen have gone. I just want to check are there any questions. No questions. That's good. So for example, one of the challenges is that AI systems require vast amounts of data. In order for it to be an effective tool for a business, it needs lots of data. And very often that will include personal data. Not in every case, but in lots of cases it will include personal data. And for the purposes today, clearly that's the stuff we're interested in. And the challenge for organizations, well, how do we process this personal data yet stay compliant with regulations like GDPR? How do we do it? So, for example, how do we ensure we minimize the data we collect? How do we obtain explicit consent? How do we maintain transparency about data? And how do we mitigate unknowns, the things that are just not known to us? So, for example, a recent chatbot was shut down because the user had managed to get the chatbot to start swearing at it. So comical in one sense, but for a business that's a challenge. So if its own chatbot starts swearing at customers and you're a customer service centric company, that very quickly becomes a problem. And I think one of the things we've seen work with clients is that how do you go about things like eliminating or managing the risks? So for things like bias, how do you build some assessment processes in this whole world of bias around algorithms? So when they're running algorithms, what does that mean for us? If you're using, if you're training an AI model, what data is being used for that? Are you able to produce any kind of evidence that the data being used has been consented data? And how do you ensure that the outcomes that the AI produces doesn't inadvertently discriminate against someone? Sorry, let me just shut my dog up. Right. The other one I want to talk about is my door. The other one I'll talk about is about the issues of data security. So AI systems, like any other system out there, can and will be targets of cyber attacks. There's no doubt about it. And having kind of robust security measures in place, such as encryption, that help to protect personal data is going to be key. And also, helping companies think about processes like impact assessment. So conducting an impact assessment to make sure that any high-risk data processes help you to eliminate any particular challenges. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is for those that buy off-the-shelf products. So by their very nature, they're quite black box. And what I mean by that is that it's quite difficult to explain how the decisions are made and what data is being used. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through some of the later slides. So in one sense, that's almost more of a challenge than if you're building your own AI models in-house. We've got some clients that want to look at developing their own models for their own purposes. There'll be others that will buy off-the-shelf products, and both have different implications to that. And I suppose it's fair to say, whilst AI is a powerful tool, and in the words of Peter Parker, for any Spider-Man fans out there, with great power comes great responsibility. And in this case, these applications can come with significant data protection responsibilities, particularly through implementing them in line with frameworks like GDPR and PECA. For me, those frameworks have been hugely beneficial. When you understand GDPR and you understand PECA, actually you can work quite safely within the confines of both. And for those we've done it for with clients, the benefits are huge. So because it allows them to develop something from the ground up, knowing they're compliant and not have to try and retrospectively fix it down the road, which obviously has huge cost benefits. In some cases, time and all those particular things. The challenge for most is understanding the points or the segues between implementing or looking to implement AI and those compliance frameworks. And we're going to look at a couple of one-liners really, just to give us a bit of an overview of both GDPR and PECA. And I wonder whether we're aware of the implications in regards to GDPR that buying off-the-shelf models versus creating your own models have. I wonder if it's something you guys have already considered. If you're looking at these tools, have you considered, well, look, if we're building our own AI models and we're using existing client data, do we need to look at things like consent because we're changing the use of the data? That's one example. Like I said, that one of the major challenges is off-the-shelf stuff. There's loads of off-the-shelf tools. Like I say, I'm not going to talk about any one in particular, but understanding how the decisions are made are important, and also what data we feed it. So when we create scripts, then what data we're using in our scripts that could be problematic if we're using our own existing client data, for example. Where is that script data going? For me, this can make it really difficult for organizations to manage their AI deployments. So whilst they're trying to work with compliance on the one hand, they've got compliance teams screaming at them because they're deploying products left, right, and center without really having a full understanding. And we're also seeing clients where their own employees are just using these tools because they're becoming so readily available, and to some extent they're being forced on them. Their suppliers are turning on these modules within their license schema, and suddenly they have these additional AI tools that there's been no real due diligence done against to see where they may or may not infringe with GDPR. And we've seen this with service providers who provide these off-the-shelf products. If you go back to them and say, look, from a transparency point of view, we need to understand the relationship between the data you use and the algorithmic results you produce when we're using your tools, so we can measure that against our own compliance standards. And for a lot of those organizations, they simply don't have the answers to that right now. They're the kind of things that we have to be aware of. GDPR requires us to be transparent. It requires us to be accountable, which is very difficult to achieve if AI decisions are not easy to interpret. That's fundamentally the bottom. That's the biggest challenge I think companies are going to struggle with in deploying it. And we must be able to implement AI tools that are explainable. There is a degree of transparency that just ensures we protect the fundamental rights of people and their data. Arguably, building your own models is a far easier prospect because you have much more control over the data sets. But like I say, the considerations are around permissions to do so. Another big challenge is data bias. So AI systems can perpetuate or even exacerbate bias based on the data they've used, the training data they've used. That can lead to unfair or discriminatory outcomes. That's a clear violation of GDPR in terms of fairness and accuracy. So ensuring that AI models are trained on diverse data sets will be really important, making sure they're regularly audited and you look to mitigate any biases. So there's a couple of starter examples of that. A couple of bits just on GDPR and PECA. This is really aimed at those that don't know anything about these two regulations, really. But they are both, as I said already, both critical frameworks that you'll need to navigate. So GDPR fundamentally sets the standard for data protection. That emphasizes things around transparency, security, accountability, those things I've already mentioned. It gives individuals significant rights on their own data. That will include understanding how you process it. So you being clear about that will be really important. It also allows them to have their data rectified, the right to be forgotten. So again, think about how their data is used. If you're looking to use your own data sets to build your own AI models, then what implications does that have if they exercise their right to be forgotten? From a broad scope position, it applies to any organization out there that processes personal data of individuals in the EU. Now, there are some additional caveats to that for the purposes of today. That's it. So from from a GDPR perspective, there are some of the key challenges we can see. From a PECA point of view, if you don't know PECA, privacy in electronic communications, that seeks to complement GDPR. You can argue there's a slight overlap or jarring, but fundamentally it's there to complement it. That focuses really on privacy in electronic communications. And a good example of that, it covers the use of cookies. So if you're using cookies for things like direct marketing communications, the security of that data requires you to obtain potentially explicit consent before you send on electronic marketing. And quite a lot of the clients that we work with don't really have a firm grip or understanding of the implications of cookies and how they need to deploy them legally. So PECA covers quite a lot of that stuff. And together, those two frameworks offer a fairly robust framework to help protect personal data. So the challenge for you is understand the nuances around the two when it comes to AI. I'm going to touch on a couple of those today just to give you a bit of a starting point. So one of the key aspects of GDPR is data minimization. So that requires organizations to only collect data that's necessary for a specific purpose. So for example, a retail company using AI to analyze customer purchase patterns must ensure it only collects data relevant to the analysis of what it's doing. And the challenge then is not to collect additional data. And what it does is just help mitigate risk of data breach and also just enhances consumer trust. So on the one hand, they know they need to collect the data that's necessary. They need to keep it minimalistic, but how do you do that when you're using AI models? And then transparency, we've touched on already. If you're using fairly complex algorithms that operate in this kind of black box environment I spoke about earlier, understanding how those decisions are made is really important. So how can you be transparent if you've got no real understanding of how those decisions are made? Because in some cases, even the suppliers don't know. And it mandates that you provide clear information about personal data and how it's processed. So a good example of that, we've worked with a client where they're using AI to screen job applicants, and they struggled to explain how the AI made decisions and how the data was analysed that didn't inadvertently eliminate someone. So that this whole piece around bias. They were looking at around 1,000 candidates a year. They are a seasonal operation. So that's the kind of thing where for them, they're using these tools now for that. When asked the question, well, how do you prevent discrimination, they couldn't answer it. And it's also about accountability. So you have to be able to demonstrate compliance through documentation. I know they're boring, they're a pain to put together, but they're really important. And my advice is to create short 1-2 page kind of policies for this kind of stuff. Think about training, what kind of training needs to be done for employees, and also conducting things like regular data protection impact assessments, particularly for high risk data processes. A good example of that would be a healthcare provider. So they're using AI to predict health outcomes because they're working with health data. Indirectly, they would have to conduct a DPIA to identify any potential risks of doing that. And I'm going to come on to that. So when I talk about methodology, you'll see that come up, and those bits hopefully will make a bit more sense. And then PECA complements GDPR. So I spoke about cookies earlier, but really it's about obtaining specific consent for certain types of marketing. So the example I've got here, you're an online advertising platform using AI to serve personalized ads. You guys need to ensure that obtains explicit consent for users to track their browsing behavior. And for me, I'm a big advocate for the word tracker rather than cookies, because cookies sounds a bit nice, but in reality, what we're doing is tracking. And depending on your own organisations, there'll be other considerations, but hopefully some of these just start to give you a sense and a bit of an idea, really. I've called this slide identifying and addressing gaps. So gaps in AI data protection compliance refers to what I say is discrepancies between what you do currently and what you need to be doing, and that's aligned to AI technologies and data protection law. And those gaps can have fairly significant implications in the event of a data breach. So when I talk about gaps, I'm talking about your current practice versus the requirements of something like GDPR. And gaps can emerge without you knowing it. So a good example of that, we've had a recent client where they've had an explosion of cookies appear. They knew nothing about it, but because of their web development company are doing upgrades and they're rolling out additional plugins to the website, they've inadvertently introduced new technologies without them knowing about it. We're definitely seeing a kind of rapid expansion of technologies going into business. And that could be something as simple as a user using a particular app on their phone that's an AI-related tool, or as I said earlier, where a tool has been forced upon you, or you have access to new tools through your existing vendor supply chain. So looking at those measures are really important. And what the gap analysis does, it allows you to know what you don't yet know, but you perhaps need to know. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. The thing I want to say about AI at this point is that fundamentally there's nothing new here. So from our point of view, working with clients, the methodology by and large is exactly the same. If you were implementing a brand new HR system that had no AI features at all, our methodology is no different in terms. The questions might differ. So, for example, we might talk about bias and algorithms because it has more of an AI slant. But if we aren't using those tools, the question set's different, but the outcome is the same. We would still look from a GDPR point of view at those things you need to be addressing in order to be compliant. So it's worth stressing that because we've had certain clients that just see this as something that's that's not going to impact them, not going to affect them. They only do one or two small things within the landscape of AI, but ultimately don't have a good view of their business. They don't know how that kind of integrates into their overall landscape. Common areas where gaps appear quite quick: data storage, data processing, consent management. So storage could involve inappropriate access. It could involve non-encryption. So if you're creating your own AI models, then you could have a lot of data sat there, and it's just not simple. It's not suitably secured or access controlled, which makes personal data really vulnerable. We've seen some examples of that. It might be you failed to properly anonymize data, so where you're changing the characteristics of the data, so you're removing any way of identifying who that person is through the data set. So there's another example there. And also about this issue of repurposing data for AI training beyond its original use. We're seeing issues where people are starting to use their own data to build models, but they haven't thought about the implications of that data in relation to the original purpose it's given to them, and helping them understand, well, you perhaps ought to be getting consent to do that from your customer base unless you can find ways to anonymize that data. And it's worth reiterating, as it may well apply to you if you intend to build around your own AI models, how to ensure the appropriate consent if you're doing that. So it's definitely a challenge we've seen when clients want to build their own models. You should conduct, in our view, regular audits. So I would be saying every 1 to 3 years you're doing a gap analysis piece where you're looking across your organization. So if you've not done one for a while, it's probably something worth considering doing, particularly if you're starting to think about AI. We've got some clients that say, we'll just look at AI in isolation, but our view is that if that AI is going to interoperate with other systems, it needs to be a wider audit. So just bear that in mind if that's something you're looking to do. And it will typically involve mapping out the data flows, and that's no different than if you're employing. If anyone's ever done a CRM deployment, you would typically map out all the workflows. You'd understand how data was going to move across the system. In many ways, that's no different than what we're proposing here. It's about identifying where data is stored, about how it's processed, who has access to it, how you might transfer that data, and you might use tools like data protection impact assessments to help you do that. And I'm going to come on to that. And what they do is they systematically help you analyze, identify, minimize data protection risk in any of your AI projects. And they should be a continuous thing, not just a one-off. And they should typically align to any kind of regulatory changes. So, like I say, 1 to 3 years is typical where you're looking to deploy a new project. So, by understanding the concept of the gaps, you can recognise the common areas that they occur, and the kind of assessments you might be put in place, depending on realistically, depending on the types of data you've got and the organisation that you are. And in doing so, what you're going to start doing is safeguarding that data. I want to talk a bit about a structured methodology for addressing gaps, and a kind of step-by-step. So I want to just talk you through. This is in my notes, so don't feel you need to sit and scribble loads of notes. Because Dan's got a quick slip of my drink. The first one I've spoken about, which is the audit, the gap analysis piece, where you're going through each department. You're probably mapping out each department, the data flows you've got, and for the purpose of today, you might limit that to where you're proposing to use AI. There could be a precursor to this. You might have done some internal work where you've had a bit of a sit down. You've sought to understand, well, okay, where could AI help us in the business? You've identified some areas you think it can help, and what you might now do is you might do this gap analysis piece. So the work we do, this is just to give an indication of how that might look. We would typically ask between 120 and 300 questions, depending on the scale of the organisation and the geography of the organisation. So it could be across multiple countries and those kind of things. And what that will look to do is it will look to identify what DPIAs are required. So any process we see as high risk, we'd flag it. And we would say, look, this process, I'll come and explain that in a minute, but we flag that process as being high risk. What you'll then do is you'd then look at your mapping piece, and you'd say, okay, from the map we've done of our systems, our AI propositions, we've got a clear understanding of what we're proposing to use. You'll do some evaluation against it, so you'll understand in terms of black box how much transparency can you get around the data. You've done a measurement against GDPR and PECA, so what the compliance considerations. I'm going to talk a bit about privacy by design in a minute. You'll use those steps to help you identify specific areas where perhaps there are definitely some gaps. So, for example, you might discover that some of the processing activity lacks any kind of lawful basis for processing. So you might address that. You may have your own in-house expertise to do that. You could go to third-party support and help. So even the regulators, the ICO, for example, you could go to. And clearly you can come and talk to us, but those kinds of things. You then look to clearly identify those gaps and start to prioritize the gaps. So quite a lot of the work we do with clients that are looking at technologies to say, okay, look, there's a whole bunch of gaps here we've identified. These are the ones you need to go in and focus on. These are the ones that pose you the greatest risk. And you might identify that some processes have different levels of risk and require different kind of prioritization. So, for example, if I had to look at a healthcare application, a gap in obtaining explicit consent from users for using their data to train AI models, we could say that's one of the processes we've mapped. And we can say there's also a gap in the transparency of AI decision-making processes in diagnostic of diseases. The first gap, so obtaining explicit consent, involves a lack of proper consent mechanisms. We can see that's the gap. That could lead to non-compliance with GDPR. It could also lead to a loss of trust from users. The second gap, though, which is a gap in the transparency of decisions that the AI tool makes in terms of diagnosis, that could have severe consequences, such as incorrect diagnosis and treatment plans, which could present significant harm. So you can see different gaps can have different levels of, of risk. And then you would focus on the one that, from a greater severity point of view. And this transparency gap should be prioritised over the first. But I think that's fairly obvious to most people. But it's through that gap analysis piece that those kind of questions begin to get understood. So being able to explain the decisions transparently that AI makes is an imperative factor, fundamentally. And in that case, from a patient welfare point of view, you'd argue it's imperative. If it's going to make suspect outcomes, then that's problematic. But I used an earlier example about screening of employees, so for seasonal workers, and knowing why some users are excluded from the automatic results is really important. So focus on high risk gaps. They're the key ones. Those where if it's making decisions, so that they're automated decisions, then they're the key ones to really focus on. Really, the other thing we would say is a really clear plan to remediate. So for every gap you've got, have a plan to fix it. And it could be you put controls around it, so you can't eliminate that risk, but you'll put some controls around it. It could be you need to increase security. You need to improve consent mechanisms. For example, in a gap we found in data encryption, if a system is found to be unencrypted and encryption is paramount, then you would look to encrypt that as quickly as possible. And then there's a process of monitoring and reviewing of those gaps ongoing. And it's fair to say it's not a one-time task. This is an ongoing thing. So we'd always encourage clients to regularly monitor the effectiveness of what you do. So if you're putting remediation steps in place, you need to monitor that to make sure that's working. You'll do that perhaps through regular audits, through regular impact assessments that just helps you maintain that. So you're taking a fairly proactive approach. I can say from experience, the ICO will take a dim view on any organisation that breaches that doesn't have an ongoing plan. So have an ongoing plan around compliance, which will be really important in the event of a breach, irrespective of the AI piece. That's no different from any other plan. And so by regularly reviewing the systems, the AI systems you've got, what you're going to do is you're just going to put a lot more trust into consumers, into customers, and into stakeholders. I want to talk about DPIAs for a minute, because this is one where I reckon if I was to put a figure against it, I'd say 90% of clients I speak to don't do DPIAs. Yet, if it's a high risk process you're carrying out, by law, you should do them. Most companies don't do them. They perhaps do them in spirit, but they aren't done. As they should be done. So, what is it? So, what it is, it's a process designed to help you systematically analyze, identify, and minimize risks. And there are a number of steps which I'm going to go through. You can download from the ICO website a template, a DPIA template. So they've made it as simple as they can. So if you've never done a DPIA, then it's worth going away, picking a process in your business and having a go at it. But this is a fundamental staple part of the work we recommend to all our clients. And from an IA perspective, from an AI perspective, and any other technology perspective, this is paramount because it gives you a really clear kind of trajectory, so questions to answer. And I'm going to give you a couple of those just to give you a feel for it. So they're essential for ensuring compliance. They'll help you demonstrate accountability and transparency, and they'll do that kind of stuff. And those steps are, firstly, identifying the need to do one. So have you got a high-risk project, such as profiling sensitive data? Yes, we have. Describe the process, document the nature, the scope. You'd assess whether the data processing is necessary. You'd look at any potential risks involved in doing it. You look at mitigation steps. How can you mitigate? Who else might you need to consult with? and you'll go through a process of documentation. So my advice is to always do this for every process you've got. In some cases, you might just do question 1. Do I need to complete one? Yes or no? If not, why not? If yes, okay, move on. So I'd encourage you to go and look at that. But in the handout, there's more notes in my slide deck, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm gonna skip through the rest of those notes. And then when it comes to mitigation strategies, you've got things like encryption. So encryption is a good one. So if you can implement strong encryption, then what you know from a risk point of view is the data's safe. If you can anonymize the data, or you can pseudonymize the data. So pseudonymization was a word I only ever learned when GDPR came out. I'd never heard it before then. But this idea of being able to use anonymized data, where you can change the characteristics of it, so that to all intents and purposes, the data is very difficult to interpret. So, for example, Mark James becomes A1693. Making sure you only minimize the minimum amount of data, and all those things become part of it. Some of the pitfalls we see, definitely a lack of transparency. When we talk to clients that are looking at using it, they don't really have a clear understanding of how the decisions are being made, how the algorithms work, and whether or not decisions being made inadvertently affect their client base. They don't do enough work around consent typically, and they over collect data. They're the kind of main ones to avoid, which we see quite often. And this is what privacy by design really is looking to address. So for those of you that have not come across it, so the concept of it is an approach whereby you're reviewing each of those things you're doing. So, for example, you would look at the DPIA as part of that assessment, and it could be things like the extensive use of personal data and understand the risks of that. So, in understanding those risks, you're starting to design systems from a privacy perspective. It goes without saying, AI systems can be really complex in terms of processing. So making sure you embed the right considerations, the right questions have been asked. So, for example, if we get a right to erase data, are we able to do that? Answering those questions early on and building those things into the design phase will be imperative. And there could be something that you'll later, you'll come back and thank yourself for. Transparency. So a good example of here, an AI-driven customer service chatbot should inform users about the data it collects and how it's processed. And if it can't do that, then it's not transparent. And again, in my handout slides, there's a whole list of other examples that I just think would be helpful. For the purpose of time, I'm going to skip through some of those things. So recommendations for success, prioritize data protection from the start. I know more and more companies are doing this now, but making sure that fundamentally that's the heart of what you do. The ICO would say data protection shouldn't be a tick box exercise. It should be something that's embedded into your business. That will definitely be something you'll need to consider. Transparency, consent, we've talked about that. Making sure you invest in the right kinds of security, doing the regular audits, fostering a culture of compliance and ethics. Those things will be really important for you, and making sure you stay up to date. There's a whole range of things you'll need to consider as you go through those projects. And I guess a little bit about from our perspective about what we can do. I'm not a salesperson at all. I'm a consultant, but one of the things I find from talking to customers is very often they just need some additional handholding. So after we do a gap analysis, we might then work with them on putting a plan together to maybe run the first workshop session or run some DPIA sessions with them to help them really think through AI in the business and just understand the implications and the red flag areas to help them really understand what they don't know. For us, we've done a fair bit of work around this. There's some bits around that stuff. So kind of the kind of post-assessment piece, we do a fair bit of work around that. And that's kind of really what I want to cover in the main stuff. Like I say, there's a fair chunk of of information available to you, yeah, I think will be some useful. Just having a look at some questions. So we've had what we've got here. Let's have a look. Okay, so the question is, the analogy was that using Google for email or Azure for cloud did not require any work other than checking if the vendor was GDPR compliant in providing their cloud services. But if we are using their AI tools, how do we check for GDPR compliance for a given use case? It's a good question. And yeah, it is difficult to get answers from those particular providers, and they've come unstuck, haven't they? Recently, I read in the press about Copilot where they're taking snapshots of screens. That's fundamentally a problem for some organisations, I'll suggest. Yeah, I'll come back with a fuller answer in that, if that's all right, because just because of purse of time. And we've got talking about AI training. Since the providers like Google, Microsoft, etc., may have used all sorts of training data, how do we assess they're using their tools? Well, I guess it depends on what you intend to use that particular tool in relation to data you've got and using. But yeah, you definitely need to consider if you're using Microsoft or Google tools, it's understanding, okay, how do you intend to use those tools and how does that relate? And that's really where the DPA stuff will come into effect on that basis. So we've got a few more minutes. Are there any other questions? If not, then we can finish a couple of minutes early. But like I say, I'll make sure that the slides are available. And if there are follow-up questions, I'm happy to take some one-to-one stuff as a follow-up if it's of use to you. But I'm hoping that for the first one we've done, that there's been some helpful content in there. Like I say, if there are any suggestions around things you would like to have seen that perhaps didn't see, then please do let us know, and we'll look to include that in any follow-up sessions we run. Is another question come in? Oh, sorry, I'm just navigating the screen. Where are we? So, yeah, so how do you check for GDPR compliance when relying on suppliers who don't transparently provide information about how that AI product is built? Well, you don't use that supplier, I suggest. That could be one option. But it's the kind of challenges suppliers are going to face. Again, it's about assessing your way of doing it. You need to measure the risk, don't you? So understand, okay, what are you asking them to do, and what's the risk in terms of the data set or you're proposing to use? What's the exposure to personal data for you? That'd be the kind of thing you would look at. Right, there's loads of questions coming in now. Any advice for schools? Okay, a bit of an open-ended question, but for again, it's understanding how schools are using AI. I suppose the risk you've got is the profile of data is likely to be children, so that will have implications. But again, is this about tools that maybe school children use as part of what they're doing? Yeah, drop us an email afterwards, and give us some specifics around that, and I'll happily follow up on that if that helps. We've done stuff with schools, so if we can give you a steer around that stuff, we will. If you're using off the shelf, how do you know it's not collecting your data? Yeah, this is a really common one. So if you're using tools like ChatGDP, I still wouldn't mention one, but let's use them as an example. And your staff are putting in your own customer details into those engines. Where does that data sit? What risk does it pose? Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's not one I can answer in the time we got left, but there are definitely considerations that we have to understand. So using companies that have built AI models that are at a kind of more local level, maybe specific to you, that they're the challenges those vendors are going to have as they start to enforce regulations around this stuff. You talked about consent. Is there a case for data usage under other legal basis? I mean, chatbot. You could argue from a chatbot point of view. You, I suppose it depends if you're using customer data. If you're using if you want to create a chatbot in your business, and you intend to use customer data, I'd want to understand why you're using customer data as part of the chatbot builder. Would you just use anonymized data? So thinking through some of those things could be helpful. Again, drop me an email afterwards, and we can have a bit more detail, a bit more conversation. If I missed any questions, I could answer. Oh, I see. I can see now where it says answer or not answered. Let's have a quick look. Are there any unanswered ones? I know I haven't really answered some of the ones you've given me, but like I say, I'll happily pick it up offline. I think some of these just need a bit more context. The schools one definitely could do a conversation. The off-the-shelf one, so we've got loads of clients use off-the-shelf products, and that's the conversation starter. That's really where the gap starts, and the DPA starts understanding. Okay, but when you talk off the shelf, what is it you're using? Where are they located? Is a good question. Are they outside of Europe? What kind of data sharing agreements have they got in place to support you? There'll be a whole raft of questions you'll need to answer around that stuff. Is there anything else that's been asked? That might be it. So unless there are any other questions, you get 3 minutes and 36 seconds back of your day. But just thank you for attending. And like I say, if we can help in a follow up, then I'm more than happy to do that. Thank you for attending.